Good afternoon. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School and the third lecture in our series, The Nature of Conflict. Tonight we welcome Professor Gunnar Sørbø, who is Senior Researcher at the Michelsen Institute in Bergen in Norway. Gunnar is a social anthropologist who focuses on development policy, planning, conflict and peace building, and social impact assessment among his various specialisms. Before joining the Michelsen Institute, he was the first director of the Center for Development Studies at the University of Bergen, and he's been on the boards of many organizations, including the Norwegian Agency for International Development, IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, the International Livestock Center for Africa, the Research Council of Norway, and the Rafto Foundation for Human Rights. We're going to hear from Gunnar for about 40 minutes, and then there will be some time for questions as well. And so I'm delighted to welcome Gunnar to talk to us about food security and conflict, narratives and interventions. Gunnar.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. The relationship between failing food security and conflict or social unrest is amply demonstrated these days as a badly strained humanitarian system finds itself facing not one, but at least 4 challenges in addition to Syria. And according to the UN, more than 20 million people are at risk of starvation and famine across South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, and northeastern Nigeria. They sort of disappeared from the news after Trump became president in Washington, but they are still there, and the situation is still serious. While much was learned already in the 1980s, when particularly Ethiopia, but also countries like Sudan and Mali and the Sahel suffered from famine and extreme food insecurity, such as the value of building so-called resilience, which is sort of a popular term these days. We used to call it reducing vulnerability, but still. The importance of early conflict prevention, the importance of cash aid, and so on. The goalposts now seem to have shifted downwards. And why is this? The simple answer seems to be conflict. It is the one symptom that affects all these 4 famine-facing regions and several others as well threatened by food insecurity. Because conflict just makes it very difficult to implement earlier lessons like building resilience, like preparing in general. Now, the evidence that conflict causes food insecurity is sort of obvious and well established in many ways. Maybe I'll try to do this by pushing the wrong arrow here. Anybody can help me on this? I can use this one? Okay. No. Sorry. Now it comes. Now it comes. Thank you. Doesn't seem that it's reacting. Yes, it's come. For example, conflict destroys land, water, both biological and social resources for food production. One of the ways it is destroying such resources is through displacement of people. You know, in 2015, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, 24 people were forced to flee their homes each minute in 2015. At the end of that year, 65 million were displaced, up 5 million from the year before. And much of this, of course, is because of wars and serious conflicts. Then a third item on my list is the use of hunger as a weapon, what we could call a food war. This is something which we know quite well, for example, from the Sudanese wars. It includes selective distribution of food to favor populations in pro-government areas. In Sudan in the 1980s, for example, when the war between the government and rebels in South Sudan was raging, hunger was used as a deliberate weapon of war. And the famine that followed had its origin in the civil war. Raiding of cattle, combined with scorched earth tactics, disrupted economic life and deprived people of assets that normally protecting them against famine. And then, of course, another item, military expenditures, will always then lower investments in health, education, agriculture, and environmental protection. Again, Sudan is a prime example of this. A very tiny sum of money is still going to health and education as well as agriculture. And then another one I just wanted to mention is that sometimes also economic sanctions against the country may be another potential source of conflict-related hunger. For example, after the Gulf War, Iraq faced economic sanctions after years of reliance on external food supplies. Although essential food was allowed, the poor had less access to food and medicines under sanctions, both because they lacked money and because the distributional policies of the Iraqi government affected them much more, of course, than middle class and richer people, which contributed not just to high child mortality, but in general, lack of food security. But what about the other way around? Does food insecurity cause conflict? It has been claimed, but the evidence here is more complex, more ambiguous, and therefore it's more interesting to explore. Following rising food prices in 2006 and 2007, violent food riots, they were called, took place in about 40 countries around the world. The food crisis, as it came to be called, pushed the number of hungry people back up towards 1 billion, reversing, at least for the time being, the progress that had been made until then. But when discussing this, the links between failing food security and conflict, it may be useful to focus attention on regions of the world that are more vulnerable to food insecurity than others, and where food insecurity has been claimed to be a catalyst of conflict. These include parts of the Middle East and North Africa, the so-called MENA countries, the Sahel, as well as the Horn of Africa. So this is the areas of the world where I will focus some attention in this brief lecture. In 2011, several countries in the Middle East were seriously affected by conflict and still remain so, the so-called Arab Spring. Most of them are also affected by failing food security. 6 of the 9 Sahelian countries west of Sudan are currently involved in armed conflicts, and undernourishment and food security have been implicated as either a cause or a consequence of several of them. And this applies as well to Somalia on the Horn. Some words about the Middle East first, focusing particularly on Egypt. Egypt, like a few other countries in that area, has been experiencing deteriorating parameters for both food production and consumption for some time. Agricultural output is constrained by limited water resources, reduced arable land, and poor public policy. Consumption has been driven by high population growth, urbanization, and subsidies. So a serious problem facing the region, particularly the non-oil states, is that of affordable food. About a fifth of the region lives under $2 a day. If we take Egypt as an example leading up to the Arab Spring in 2011, there was an increase in the prevalence of food insecurity from 14% of the population in 2010 to more than 17% of the population in 2011, which is actually about 14 million people. This increase was driven largely by rising poverty rates and a succession of crises from 2005, including the avian influenza epidemic, the food, fuel, and financial crisis of 2007-2009, and there were also global food price rises from late 2010. And as a result, a lot of households, twice as many actually, were pushed into food insecurity than those moving out of it in 2011. When food prices increase, the impact on household spending is enormous, and its effect is magnified politically and socially in two ways. The first is that higher prices are felt disproportionately by the urban population, which may enjoy higher incomes than the rural poor, but do not share the extra income that growers receive from rising food prices. The second is the less severe but politically critical vulnerability of the region's middle class in a country like Cairo, which is sensitive to changes in food prices and more so than their peers in richer economies. Food subsidies have been an important element of these economies since the 1950s. For those of you who have been to Egypt, you will know that bread has always been traditionally almost free of charge. Egypt spent, for example, in 2010, about $3 billion on bread subsidies. It's sometimes called the democracy of bread. It's a kind of social contract that has been there between the regimes and their citizens to ensure peace and stability. And food, or specifically the price of food, has always played a role in the domestic politics of this region. Since the 1970s, there have been reductions. When there have been reductions in some subsidies, there have been violent protests. In Egypt in the late 70s, in Morocco in the early 80s, Tunisia and also in the 80s, Jordan in 1996, and so on. But at the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011, as protests erupted, first in Tunisia and then in Algeria, Yemen, Bahrain, Jordan, and Egypt, the price of food was widely seen as a significant, if not principal, factor in prompting the unrest. The food price index had been rising since the beginning of 2009 and actually peaked in February 2011. There was a 68% increase. And the cereals price index rose even sharper by 75% in a very short period of time from 2010 to 2011. But there were also high levels of unemployment, especially amongst educated youth. There was a steady increase in the cost of living and an erosion of living standards. Sharp rises in domestic food prices from 2007 onwards contributed to an unraveling of the social contract between the regimes and the citizens. Governments across the regions, including those that were not immediately threatened by protests, tried to alleviate pressure by the customary method of increasing subsidies and raising public sector salaries and pensions. These measures suggested that those in power believed that political grievances either masked underlying economic problems or at least that people would be placated by addressing those problems. But subsidies did not cover all foods, and even in categories where they did, their impact was mitigated by corruption and black market sales. A review of the relationship between food security problems and social unrest in the Middle East and North Africa, conducted by David Rosenberg, concludes that the price of food was widely seen as a significant, if not principal factor in prompting the unrest. And rising food prices played a role in fomenting Arab Spring unrest, but appear to have been quickly overtaken by other grievances. In the run-up to the uprisings, both living standards and food security deteriorated, but several factors precipitated the Arab Spring. It is true that food prices rose fairly rapidly in Egypt, but Algeria and Jordan also experienced rising prices while containing political unrest. Tunisia, with smaller changes in food prices, was the first country to erupt. In Egypt, though, food played an important symbolic role, as the Tahrir Square in Cairo became the center for people's demands, as was stated very explicitly, the demands for bread, dignity, and justice. These are examples of the possible role of food price hikes as catalysts of conflict, often observed in urban settings. Let us now consider another constellation. I will then move to Sudan, where I have myself done most of my research over the years. But it's also an example of what is a more general trend across Africa in the Sahelian region, where food security has also been claimed to be a catalyst of social and political unrest, mainly, of course, proxied by natural resource scarcity. But I will use Sudan as an example. Civil war has raged in Sudan for most of the time since the country achieved its independence in 1956. In 2005, a so-called comprehensive peace agreement was signed between the government in the capital Khartoum and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in South Sudan. And this later precipitated the secession and independence of South Sudan in 2011. But before this, during this interim peace period from 2005, the United Nations Environmental Programme published in 2007 a post-conflict environmental assessment, as it was called. It argued that there are strong linkages between environment and conflict in Sudan, and that these linkages go both ways. On the one hand, Sudan's long history of conflict has had significant impacts on the environment through population displacement, through lack of governance, conflict-related resource exploitation, and simply also underinvestment in sustainable development. But on the other hand, it argued, environmental issues are contributing causes to conflict. Land issues are important causative factors, and confrontations over rangelands, pastures, and rain-fed agricultural land in the drier parts of the country are, as the report wrote, a particularly striking manifestation of the connection between natural resource scarcity and violent conflict. Land is fundamental to understanding the way in which the Sudanese conflicts and humanitarian crisis have evolved and has been fought over or in many different ways. Since the colonial period, the Sudanese state has owned, managed, or effectively controlled the so-called modern economic sectors. And state resources have been concentrated in the central Nile areas, south of or close to the capital of Khartoum, reflecting the long-standing political dominance of a limited number of ethnic groups from this area. A process of uneven development and economic dislocation began during the colonial period, when the same happened actually. Very large irrigation schemes established, actually the world's largest irrigation scheme for cotton production, established just south of Khartoum. And it continued, and it became particularly severe and massive in the 1970s. There was a shift from subsistence agriculture to export-oriented mechanized agricultural schemes, and it was particularly in this belt, if you look at the capital of Khartoum, and just south of it and moving westwards and eastwards, where these semi-mechanized schemes were established, and it resulted in the dispossession of small-holding farmers from their customary rights of land, the erosion of land use rights by pastoralists, and the creation of a large force of agricultural wage laborers, whose numbers were increased through displacement by drought and war in the 1980s and the 1990s. And one of the vital factors was the passage of laws undermining the control that local populations and local authorities were able to exert over land. In 1970, the customary rights of land was legally abolished, and the authority with respect to land allocation was vested in the state, allowing thereby for the leasing of land to large farms by the state. And this agricultural growth model, which was adopted, gave very little or no consideration to those who were displaced or otherwise affected. The strategy also caused serious problems. Yields were hit by falling fertility, which in turn reflected continuous cropping and the expansion of semi-mechanized farming into increasingly marginal areas. There was no, and there is no, environmental governance. And since the 1970s, and still today, there have been massive population flows out of the ailing traditional sector into urban centers. So the serious conflicts that have spread throughout so many parts of Sudan since the 1980s can be seen as part of a pattern of violence where the Sudanese state, as a vehicle for special interest groups, has played a major role. In brief, the country continues to suffer from two sets of crises that are closely interrelated: a crisis of governance, to put it mildly, and a livelihoods crisis. The conflicts that result from these crises take place on different levels and are also interrelated. But is it possible to argue that food insecurity caused conflict? I will use Darfur as a brief, but I think instructive example. It emerged, as some of you will know, as the world's most serious humanitarian crisis in 2003 and 2004. It led to various forms of involvement by the international community, humanitarian aid, indictment of the Sudanese president by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and possible genocide, troops coming from the UN and the African Union, so-called hybrid troops, and so on and so forth. It was widely portrayed as a conflict between Arab and non-Arab populations, and the Arab populations having full support of the Sudanese government. The crisis in Darfur has often been talked about as being caused, at least partly, by climate variability or even climate change. it is argued that declining rainfall and land degradation intensified struggles over access to pasture, to farmland, and to water, culminating in civil war and humanitarian crisis in 2003. And a similar narrative has been adopted by the Sudan government, attributing the conflict in Darfur to environmental change and increased pressure on natural resources. As a consequence, it would seem to be that had there been more rain, there would not have been war. Darfur, however, remained fairly stable until the late 1980s, mainly because there was an agreement among the major ethnic groups regarding access to natural resources, particularly land and grazing. There were two distinct systems of land tenure, one being the most common, and particularly all over the pastoral areas with nomads and semi-nomads, was based on customary law, where land is owned by the community and you get access by being member of this community. You have only use rights to land. The other one is freehold land, which was established in some pockets of Darfur, where land was registered because of stable sedentary cultivation, and then held as private property by individuals with an exclusive right, which is common along the Nile in North Sudan. The coexistence of these systems was not very difficult as long as land was available, as long as the availability exceeded need. But beginning in the 1980s particularly, there was increasing pressure on land as a result of both consecutive years of drought and growth of both animal and human populations. And this caused migration, particularly from northern Darfur into the central and southern Darfur. And it threatened the symbiosis between two dominant production systems in Darfur. And in many ways, by the time the two main rebel groups emerged in 2003, the Sudan Liberation Army, as it was called, and the Justice and Equality Movement, there was already widespread inter-community violence over land. It had begun to take place across Darfur. While they made regional or even national claims that aimed at transcending ethnic cleavages with demands for a more equitable distribution of power and wealth for all of Sudan, their base was for the most part non-Arab. And over time, these fault lines of conflict became increasingly complex, and political and livelihood landscapes changed dramatically. So, to a large extent, to put it very briefly, the engine of the insurrection in Darfur was local strife concerning access to land and water. But local, and which is very important, local conflicts were increasingly absorbed into, entangled with, or at least affected by macro political conflicts, even beyond international borders, as the systems of conflict spanned across to Libya as well as to Chad. So to a large extent, the factors that pushed Darfur over the edge were external. It includes drought, yes, and access to resources and the competition for resources, but it also includes impacts of the Chadian wars, meddling by Colonel Gaddafi, who had ambitions in Chad, wanted to sort of create a sort of Arab belt in northern Chad. And this Libyan meddling was supported by governments in Khartoum. There were arming of Arab militias in Darfur, which increased the level of conflicts as well. And a number of destructive interventions by the Khartoum government, not least putting Darfur in extremely marginal position, all projects of development being mostly at central Khartoum in the Nile Valley. Climate variability has always been an important feature of the environment in Sahelian region, including Sudan. And different production systems have traditionally tried to adapt more or less successfully to such variability. But because of these developments, because of these different factors affecting the region, vulnerability to environmental hazards has generally increased, and growing competition between different livelihood groups promotes conflict as well as environmental degradation. This is important. It's a simple message, but it's important because it also applies to trying to make peace. If food security had been a concern with those trying to make peace in Darfur, large Arab populations, which were demonized actually and sidelined in the peace process, would have been included around the table. But food security was never a concern. Actually, what has happened in Darfur during the last 5 years is that more people have been killed in intra-Arab conflicts and small wars than killings between Arabs and non-Arab groups. So that is very much related to the environmental hazards and the problems of food security in that region, which is not unique to Khartoum, to Darfur, but also to other places in this Sahelian belt. But an important message there is that while many conflicts have serious environmental and food security dimensions, ways out of this livelihoods conflict cycle that is experienced by so many people require the support of wider systems of good governance, which simply do not exist today, to put it again mildly. Very briefly on Somalia, I will just use this example because in 2011-2012, around 250,000 people died in southern Somalia famine, which also displaced and destroyed the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands more. Famines always have multiple causes. I have gone through this. I'll take factors behind the Darfur crisis. Just to show very briefly how complex often the factors are, there were triggering factors behind the famines. There was drought, yes, but there was also conflict, and there was high food price inflation. There were at least 3 underlying causes. The collapse of the Somali state, a more or less chronic livelihoods crisis in Somalia, and in some places extreme environmental degradation. But there were also many complicating factors. It turned out that there was an absence of major humanitarian actors, in particular the World Food Programme. There was presence of armed non-state actors, branded as terrorist organizations, Al-Shabaab mainly. There were international efforts to destroy those organizations. There was restrictions because of counter-terrorism laws. There were limitations of movements. There was forced displacement, and there were also shifting livelihood strategies in Somalia based on market demand for cash crops. In some areas, people starting to cultivate sesame because of the good prices, and then becoming more vulnerable because they were no longer cultivating sorghum or grain. The presence of Al-Shabaab led to the absence of a number of international humanitarian agencies that could have mitigated the crisis and been in a position to respond, and particularly the World Food Programme. There was a fear of funds being diverted to Al-Shabaab, and the fear of being sanctioned, particularly by the US, if seen as providing anything that could be seen as support for terrorist organizations. And it resulted in little being done to mitigate the impending crisis. I don't have enough time to go into this case very much now, but there has been recently a book published by Daniel Maxwell on Somali famine, and it takes up a number of these issues, particularly asking questions about accountability. He misses a real debate on accountability for what happens in cases like that to Somalia, and argue that there is a tendency to focus on technical issues like resilience, building resilience and so on, rather than all the political constraints that face areas like, not only like Somalia, but as I told you, about also Sudan. So the result is that so many of these public efforts that have been devoted to improving responses to extreme food insecurity since the 1970s, the 1980s, have not been applied in many of these situations, including Somalia. I'm towards my conclusion. There are many different types of conflict in the world and many different causal explanations. One type of explanation of violent conflict, and one being close to our topic this evening, is environmental scarcity argument. The essence of this argument is that the contest for control over declining natural resources, often intensified by population pressures, is a major cause of violent conflict around the world. Scarcity may be due to degradation of environmental resources, pressures due to population growth, or arise from unequal distribution of resources. Based on a review of research 6 years ago, Brinkman and Hendricks asked this question: is food security a cause of conflict? The answer was a qualified yes. Food insecurity, particularly when caused by higher food prices, heightens the risk of democratic breakdowns, civil conflict, protest, rioting, and communal conflict. But conflicts come in many forms. There are conflicts between the state and an opposition group. There are communal conflicts between two or more distinct communities. And there are urban conflicts or urban unrest. Brinkman and Hendricks argue that food insecurity may motivate participation in armed civil conflict at the individual level. But acute food insecurity may also diminish conflict because it diminishes the resources available to militants. It can hinder active political participation. And food denial is often part of the counter-insurgency operations. The causal link, therefore, between food insecurity and civil conflict is both complex and ambiguous. Communal conflicts tend to cluster in areas where land and water are scarce, such as the regions of the Sahel. Recurrent droughts have undermined cooperative relationships between pastoralists and sedentary farmers, as pastoralists encroach on farmlands, like in Sudan. Because herding activities take place in marginal lands, these conflicts often take place against the backdrop of chronic or frequent food insecurity. And they are made worse by poverty and political exclusion. However, some studies have found that communal conflict is more prevalent during times of both relative food insecurity and abundance. So it is not a simple relationship. And when it comes to food riots, particularly in urban situations, studies seem to argue that it's more likely to occur in authoritarian states with few political freedoms and a high incidence of economic and human poverty, of course not very surprising. Low rates of urbanization reduce the likelihood of food protests, as does the presence of social protection programs. These rather general conclusions are also supported in a global review, which says that food security worries can spark public protest when mixed with a sense of broader injustices. One conclusion then to be drawn from this kind of discussion is that civil conflict is rarely, and it's not surprising, it's rarely grounded in single grievances or simple causes, but commonly it represents the accumulation of a complex set of interrelated factors. Thus, while food insecurity and poverty may be contributors to political instability and conflict, neither hunger nor poverty exist in a vacuum. Other aspects of the political, social, and economic environment affect the degree to which failing food security and grievances more generally are expressed violently. This means, of course, that the links are context-specific, that food security, insecurity often joins with other factors to worsen political instability. Food insecurity can be a motivation for political mobilization as well as a risk multiplier. The links are context-specific in the sense that they are contingent on existing political institutions, levels of economic development, social safety nets, as well as demographic pressures. And the effects are typically played out in interaction with other conflict-promoting factors. And finally, this is very much in correspondence with conclusions drawn in the literature with regard to the relationship between climate change and conflict. I would just argue that some of this literature seems to hold a quite negative view of this link between climate change and conflict, arguing all the time that there is no link. But climate change will often result in a reduction of resources for livelihood. It will affect food security, which can lead to competition and conflict for remaining resources. As we have seen in Darfur, when migrants encroach on the territory of others who may also be resource constrained, the potential for violence rises. Thus, climate change is likely to increasingly undermine both food security and human security more generally by simply reducing access to and the quality of natural resources that are important to sustain livelihoods. And climate change is also likely, of course, to undermine the capacity of states to provide the opportunities and services that help people to sustain their livelihoods. In certain circumstances, therefore, there are definitely both direct and indirect impacts of climate change and food and human security. And they may, in turn, increase the risk of violent conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gunnar. We have a little time for some questions. I should warn you that this is being webcast and filmed, so if you don't want to be webcast and filmed, please save a question until after the end. There is a roving mic, so if there's a question here at the front to start with. So if you just wait for the mic to arrive.
Thank you. So, as I understand, we are facing the climate wars. Is it right? So to say, climate wars. And if it is so, to what extent the so-called just war theory may be applicable as a normative device to settle this kind of wars? Just war theory, you know.
You should have your mic.
I have my mic on, yeah. Well, I did not really argue that we are facing climate wars, but of course, climate change will be a factor, an important factor, increasing the chances of violence. That is of course true, but it never comes alone. That was my argument. It comes in the context of many other factors, depending on regimes, the lack of, or institutions, what kind of institutions you have, social safety nets and so on. I think we jumped too quickly to talking about climate change, particularly, for example, in the Sahelian areas. We have always had a considerable climate variability, where you have had years of drought, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, consecutive years of drought. But there have been possibilities for adapting, because that has been more or less a recurrent pattern. So what I'm after is to try to look at what is it then, and how does these different factors affect the political developments. And then, of course, there are linkages between climate, which I did not focus on, but problems of food security affecting violence. But these are complex and sometimes ambiguous links.
I have two questions. One related to Somalia, just to kind of information. The land that was being rented by the government, having been taken from the smallholders, I'm curious, who was it rented to, and to where was the food being exported, and who was providing, was the training being provided to use the machines and so on, or was it an indigenous push towards blah, blah, blah? Centralized agriculture?
Yes, this process started seriously in Sudan in the 1950s when, during colonial times, there was this enormously large irrigation scheme they called the Gezira scheme, which was then the largest scheme in the world under one management, producing cotton particularly. But starting from the 50s, the government leased, there was a leasehold possibility for mostly urban merchants or well-off people, or people who were just linked up politically to the elite in Khartoum, getting quite large schemes where they could use rather simple mechanized, semi-mechanized in the sense that they were using tractors for some operations, but they were also using a lot of labor. And much of that labor came from Darfur, actually, starting before the 50s, but these populations are still there in eastern Sudan. And that moved further west during the 60s and the 70s, became very massive. It has continued. We then had an Islamic government coming to power in 1989. There was even more of a confrontation then. They had a program they called the Civilization Project, which they argued that they would work for or build self-sufficiency in food. But actually there was a very poor agricultural strategy, and it was a complete failure. During the last 5-10 years, there has been what has now come to be called land grabbing, where other countries or business enterprises in other countries have signed contracts with the Sudan government. The last one was a big contract with the Saudi government, and Saudi Arabia to a large extent supports now the government in Khartoum. After the separation of South Sudan, Sudan lost much of the oil income, and the oil income was also used for the political machinery, patronage, and so on. And at the moment, the support by Saudi Arabia particularly means a lot. But that includes that kind of contracts, which we now call land grabbing, but it has the same effect. We are being told, for example, that no people are living there, but actually these are lands particularly used by nomadic, semi-nomadic groups during parts of the year. And they have been very much affected for a very, very long time. And so they are squeezed into smaller areas, and there is more competition between themselves. But the people running the semi-mechanized schemes are mainly loyal to the government which at any time has been in place in Khartoum, and representing particularly merchant interests.
Just quickly, a second question. The West is moving, on food resilience, as we approach kind of the crisis points of global warming and climate change, whatever, we're moving towards more and more centralized agriculture, more and more subsidies reinforcing the centralization of agriculture and all the economics being skewed towards centralization of agriculture and centralization of our entire infrastructure, in fact. I wonder if that's, in your opinion, a sensible idea if we want to become more resilient. You were talking about resilience in other places which were more unstable because of the sort of the lack of entrenched indigenous infrastructure, governmental infrastructure. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, yeah, I wonder what your opinion is on that.
Yeah, these are the lands I'm talking about are in vulnerable areas, but it has been made worse by the fact that the government has allowed, for example, cultivation to take place further and further north. In very, very marginalized lands, having the effects that these lands are being degraded. This is what I mean when there is absolutely no environmental governance. This has to do simply due to contacts, political type of contacts, which then allows people to do these kind of things. But I'm not arguing that, and some of the areas now, or traditionally, being used by livestock holders are lands that could not be used by agriculture anyway. And livestock production is already plays a very, very important part of the Sudanese economy already. But I'm not arguing in just keeping the traditional systems by themselves because they are good by themselves. But the fact is in Sudan is that there has been no other agricultural strategy than allowing for this kind of, in many ways, senseless, ecologically senseless, and actually in the long run also economically senseless expansion in a country which has great promise in terms of production, not only along the Nile, but also in the rather wet areas north of or in the borderlands between Sudan and South Sudan. But very, very large populations have been pushed out because of this and becoming laborers, of course. And at the same time as the country has not really profited in terms of the country's economy either from this kind of strategy. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Professor, for an excellent presentation. I work with Oxfam. You mentioned a very interesting point about a correlation between increasing food prices and unrest, namely in the Arab Spring. And I'm interested in the gender dynamics, the potential gender dynamics behind this. I'm a bit familiar with South Sudan, and usually women are the ones facing the brunt of this increased food prices. They're the ones buying food on markets, and when prices increase, they're usually the one who have to find innovative ways, coping mechanisms to actually bring home the adequate amount of food. So I wonder if there is a certain pattern in terms of the participation in people like demonstrating or in unrest. Is it mainly men, or the extent to which women are involved? Because in South Sudan, for example, there's a lot of people fighting, and it's mostly youth or young male. So I'm interested a bit in this potential dynamics or gender dynamics. Thank you.
I think to the extent that there is any general about this, it's that it may be a triggering factor, but it very quickly is combined with other factors, you know. If you take Sudan again as an example, the situation has been very precarious for very large populations during the last few years because prices have gone up very much. There was also an attempt of a very small Arab Spring some years back, in 2013, 2 years after the Arab Spring further in Khartoum. What happened is that quite a lot of people were killed by security forces, and a lot of people were arrested and so on and so forth. So despite that the fact has deteriorated even since 2013, there is a fear of uprisings and marching in the streets and so on. But if there is a pattern to this, is that sudden food price hikes is very often a kind of triggering factor that get people onto the streets. But when they are onto the streets, they are against the government more generally, like in the Sudan, where they have had a very authoritarian government since 1989, with wars and civil conflicts extremely serious. So I don't think it's very easy to generalize over this, but it is often, as I said, an important sort of startup kind of factor, because of despair more than anything else.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. My name's Brendan Bromwich from King's College London. I'm very grateful for your insights on Darfur. Now, Darfur, one of the fascinating things is how in peacetime you have a solidarity associated with livelihood, and then in conflict, some of the ethnic dimensions are essential to the solidarities in which conflict takes place. So I'm just saying that to elicit from you some more reflections as a social anthropologist on some of these dynamics of conflict that you've mentioned. Is that pattern in Darfur, which was obviously manipulated by Gaddafi and others to get this racial conflict linked with the livelihoods conflict, is that pattern of manipulation of these identities something you see elsewhere? Is this something, you mentioned that people come out on the street because of bread prices, and then it becomes about something else. Now, could you just add a little bit more from a social anthropological perspective about the morphing of these conflicts?
Yeah, it is. I mean, if you take Darfur, it is of course much more complex than I was able to do in a short time here. On the one hand, there have been quite difficult relationship between some of these ethnic groups that have then come to ally against the government. You have, the two major non-Arab groups, the Fur. From the Fur comes the name Darfur, the home of the Fur, and the Sahrawi. And the Sahrawi have been heading most of these movements and the soldiers fighting. There have been traditionally quite hostile relations between the Sahrawi and the Fur. One of the reasons being the Sahrawi came from the northern Darfur into central areas after the drought, and then this leading to competition between them and the Fur, as well as some of the Arab groups. But then there was these sensitive and difficult relationship then were transformed into a common, taking a common stand then against the Janjaweed and the different groups armed by the government. But it's interesting to speak to Darfurians today. They said that if people had left us alone, we would have been able to re-establish the system of symbiosis which we had before. And I have a special interest at the moment in whether, together with a colleague from Darfur, to see whether it's possible to think in terms of local zones of peace. Because there are some areas of Darfur which have been quite peaceful. And one of the reasons why they have been peaceful is that they have had strong socio-political institutions that have been quite not independent, but at least quite powerful in relation to the government. They have also made their own deals with the southern Sudanese nomadic groups, the Dinka, for movements across the now what is now international boundaries. And to see whether it would be possible to do anything in terms of support for these zones of peace, which are quite large, whereas other areas have broken completely down, and there is absolutely no, it's a kind of anarchy where you have landlords having carved up different types of areas, including these paramilitary groups recruited by the government, the rapid support forces, which are formally also patrolling the borders with Libya and managing migration, but in reality also being very local power holders in Darfur. So it has become a very complex pattern, but it is different parts of Darfur are also in comparative peace. The problem has been for a long time that this attempts of building peace locally has been undermined, and not least by the government, because there is an interest by parts of the government in keeping some of this violence going for different reasons. And there are different actors involved. So it is a very complicated picture, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to have to close there, I'm afraid. Before we do, I just want to draw your attention to a couple more events. Next week, this lecture series, The Nature of Conflict, comes to an end. We have 2 events in the series. On Monday at 12:30 here, we have David Jensen, who is the head of the Environmental Cooperation for Peacebuilding Initiative at the UN Environment Programme. We'll be talking on environment, conflict, and peacebuilding, a personal journey of change within the UN. And then this time next week, on Thursday at 5, we have Professor Dominic Johnson. He is Oxford's Alistair Buchan Professor of International Relations. He's also an evolutionary biologist. So he's going to be talking on the ecology of war, an evolutionary perspective on conflict over resources and prospects for peace. And that will conclude the series. And then just one more to mention to you. We have an event in partnership with the Resolution Foundation in election week. So if you're looking for intelligent debate, you know where to turn to. The Resolution Foundation have an intergenerational commission. So this very important issue of, as they've termed it, an age-old problem, exploring Britain's new wealth divides. And Lord Willits, who will be chairing a discussion. We'll be hearing from their inquiries and some of their experts, and Professors John Muhlbauer and Brian Nolan from Oxford will also be discussing possible policy responses. And that's on 5th of June at 4 o'clock in this room. So I'd just like to close thanking Gunnar for his expertise and insights into such an important topic. Thank you.